In 1979, inside a locked conference room at Ford's headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan, a group of executives sat around a table with a single decision in front of them that could have changed automotive history forever. On the table was a proposal to slash production, gut the budget, and quietly phase out one of the company's oldest product lines within 5 years. If that proposal had gone through exactly as written, the vehicle sitting in almost every driveway in America today, the vehicle responsible for tens of billions of dollars in profit every single year, the vehicle that has been the best-selling automobile in the United States for over 4 decades straight, would not exist. Ford almost killed the pickup truck that ended up saving the entire company, twice. And the story of how that truck clawed its way back from the edge of cancellation, not once, but twice, is one of the most insane corporate gambles in the history of the automotive industry. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you will never look at a Ford pickup the same way again, and you will understand exactly why a boring metal box with 4 wheels became more valuable to Ford than every single car model in their entire lineup combined. Before we get into how close this all came to disappearing forever, I need you to understand just how unlikely this entire success story really is, because almost nothing about this truck's origins suggested it was destined for greatness. This wasn't some brilliant, carefully engineered masterpiece that everyone at Ford knew would change the world. It was quite literally the opposite. It was an unwanted, unglamorous side project that survived purely because a handful of people refused to give up on it at the exact moments when giving up would have been the easiest, most logical thing in the world to do. And that pattern, survival against overwhelming odds, repeats itself so many times throughout this story that by the end, you're going to start wondering if this truck was somehow cursed and blessed at the exact same time. Let's rewind the clock all the way back to 1917. Ford wasn't thinking about trucks as a serious business. The Model T was already dominating American roads, and pickup trucks were treated like an afterthought, a side hustle bolted onto an existing car platform just so farmers and tradesmen could haul lumber and crops without buying a separate specialized vehicle. The very first Ford truck, called the Model TT, was essentially a Model T with a heavier frame and a cargo bed thrown on the back. Nobody inside Ford believed this clunky utility vehicle had any long-term future. It was viewed internally as a low-margin product built for a niche customer base of farmers and small business owners, nothing more. For decades, trucks lived in the shadow of Ford's passenger cars. Executives obsessed over sedans, coupes, and convertibles because that's where the glamour was, that's where the advertising dollars went, and that's where the profit margins were supposedly the highest. Trucks were dirty, they were utilitarian, and frankly, they were seen as beneath the brand that wanted to sell the American dream on 4 wheels. Meanwhile, competitors like Chevrolet and Dodge were building their own utility trucks too, and internally, Ford's leadership genuinely worried that this entire vehicle category might just be a temporary fad tied to the agricultural economy of the era, something that could fade away entirely once the country modernized and paved roads, made specialized hauling vehicles less essential for the average family. Nobody in that boardroom in the 1920s or 1930s was dreaming about billions of dollars in future profit. They were simply trying to figure out whether trucks were worth the manufacturing floor space at all. Then in 1948, Ford finally gave trucks their own dedicated identity with the launch of the F-Series, starting with the F1. This was the F1. This was the first time Ford built a truck platform completely separate from its car lineup, with its own styling, its own frame, and its own personality. It was a smart move, but even then, nobody at Ford was betting the company's future on it. Trucks were still considered a secondary product line, something you built quietly in the background while the real spotlight stayed on cars like the Thunderbird, the Fairlane, and later, the Mustang. For nearly 3 decades, the F-Series quietly built a loyal following among farmers, construction workers, and ranchers, but it stayed firmly in second place behind Ford's passenger car business in terms of internal priority, marketing budget, and executive attention. And then came 1973, followed by an even worse gut punch in 1979, and everything Ford thought it knew about the American consumer got turned completely upside down. The 1973 oil crisis hit the United States like a sledgehammer. Gas prices tripled almost overnight. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. Americans who had grown up believing that gasoline would always be cheap and plentiful suddenly found themselves rationing fuel and waiting hours just to fill up their tank. Detroit automakers panicked. Big engines, heavy steel bodies, and gas-guzzling trucks were suddenly public enemy number one in the eyes of the average American buyer. Sales of full-size pickup trucks cratered. Inside Ford's boardrooms, a very real and very serious conversation began. Should the company keep investing in a product category that seemed destined to become obsolete in a future where gasoline might never be cheap again? Fuel-efficient Japanese imports were flooding the market, and smaller, lighter vehicles were suddenly the smart financial bet. Some executives argued that continuing to pour money into heavy, thirsty pickup trucks was financial suicide in this new economic reality. Internal sales projections from that period painted a bleak picture. Dealerships across the country were sitting on lots full of unsold full-size trucks, and the finance department was calculating exactly how much money the company stood to lose if this trend continued for even a few more quarters. For a business built on economies of scale, a truck program that suddenly couldn't move inventory wasn't just a marketing problem, it was a factory shutdown problem, a layoff problem, a supplier contract problem that rippled out across an entire ecosystem of parts manufacturers who depended on Ford's production volume to stay in business themselves. Then, just when the industry thought it had adjusted to the new normal, 1979 arrived and delivered a second oil shock that was arguably even more brutal than the first. The Iranian Revolution disrupted global oil supplies, prices spiked again, and this time the psychological damage to the American truck market was even deeper. Sales numbers that had barely recovered from the first crisis collapsed all over again. This is the exact moment where the proposal to gut the F-Series program landed on the table. The math on paper looked terrifying. Truck sales were sliding, fuel prices were unpredictable, manufacturing costs were rising, and Ford as a company was bleeding cash across nearly every division. The corporation as a whole was in genuine financial danger during this period, posting massive losses that had shareholders and board members questioning the very survival of the company. In an environment like that, cutting an entire product line that suddenly looked outdated and inefficient seemed like the responsible, rational business decision. Some executives wanted to shrink the truck lineup down to a token presence, redirect engineering resources towards smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles, and essentially treat the once proud F-Series as a dying relic of a bygone era of cheap gas and big engines. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like a straightforward business decision that any reasonable executive would have made given the numbers on the table, you need to sit with that for a second, because that's exactly what makes this story so fascinating. This wasn't a case of foolish executives ignoring obvious warning signs. The data genuinely supported killing or drastically shrinking the truck program. Almost any rational read of the situation in 1979 would have concluded the same thing. And that's precisely why what happened next is so remarkable, because it means the difference between a multi-billion-dollar success story and a corporate footnote came down to a small handful of people willing to bet against a mountain of terrifying evidence. But here's where the story takes its first major turn, the moment that changed everything. A smaller group inside Ford's truck division refused to accept that conclusion. They looked at the exact same sales data that was terrifying the accountants and saw something completely different hidden underneath the panic. Yes, sales had dropped, but the customers who were still buying full-size trucks weren't casual buyers looking for basic transportation. They were farmers, contractors, ranchers, and small business owners who needed serious hauling and towing capability to run their livelihoods, and no small fuel-efficient import could replace that. These buyers weren't going to abandon trucks just because gas got more expensive, because for them, a truck wasn't a luxury or a lifestyle choice, it was a tool they depended on every single day to make money. This core group of loyal, high-need buyers represented a smaller but far more stable and far more profitable customer base than anyone inside Ford had fully appreciated before. Instead of retreating and scaling down, this group made an extremely risky counter-argument. Rather than treating the F-Series as a shrinking afterthought, Ford should double down, refine it, make it more efficient without sacrificing capability, and turn it into the single best truck an American working man could buy. It was a bet that flew directly against the terrifying financial data sitting in front of the board. It worked. Through the early 1980s, Ford invested in improving fuel efficiency across the F-Series lineup without gutting the power and durability the truck was famous for. They refined the engines, improved aerodynamics, and modernized the design just enough to stay relevant without alienating the loyal customer base that depended on serious towing and hauling capability. And slowly, as the oil shocks faded into memory and gas prices stabilized through the 1980s, something remarkable happened. The F-Series didn't just recover, it exploded. In 1982, the F-Series climbed to become the best-selling vehicle in the entire United States, a title it would go on to hold for the next several decades, longer than almost any other product in American manufacturing history. Think about that for a second. A product line that Ford's own executives were prepared to gut just a few years earlier became the single most dominant selling machine in the entire American auto industry, generating profit margins on individual trucks that dwarfed almost every car Ford was building at the time. By the mid-1980s and into the early 1990s, the F-Series wasn't just recovering, it was transforming into something bigger than a truck. It was becoming a piece of American cultural identity. Ford leaned into this shift with confidence. Marketing campaigns built around toughness, reliability, and the idea that this was the vehicle for people who actually built things with their hands, people who worked construction sites, ran ranches, and started small businesses out of the back of their truck bed. That emotional connection turned out to be worth more than any single feature or spec sheet number, because it created a level of brand loyalty that almost no other vehicle in America could match. Once a customer bought their first F-Series and it didn't let them down, they became a customer for life, and often for generations, with sons buying the same truck their fathers swore by. This is the kind of brand loyalty that money literally cannot buy through advertising alone, and it became the foundation that would carry the F-Series through every single crisis still waiting for it down the road. But if you think the drama ends there, you are seriously underestimating just how close this truck came to disaster a second time. Fast forward to 2008. The global financial crisis hit, and this time it wasn't just an oil shock, it was a full-blown economic collapse. Gas prices spiked to record highs earlier that year before the crash, the housing market imploded, credit froze, and consumer confidence in America hit levels not seen since the Great Depression. Once again, full-sized pickup trucks, the very same F-Series that had saved Ford 3 decades earlier, became a symbol of everything supposedly wrong with American consumption. Environmental pressure was mounting, fuel economy regulations were tightening dramatically, and General Motors and Chrysler were forced into government bailouts just to survive. Ford, remarkably, avoided taking a federal bailout, but the company was hemorrhaging cash and its stock price had collapsed to under $2 a share at one terrifying point. Once again, inside Ford's leadership, serious conversations began about the long-term viability of the gas-hungry, steel-bodied, full-size truck in a future of tightening emissions regulations and a consumer base that seemed to be shifting towards smaller, greener vehicles. Stop and really think about what was happening at this exact moment in history. Ford had just watched two of its biggest American rivals collapse into government bailouts. Consumer trust in the entire auto industry was at rock bottom. Fuel economy regulations coming out of Washington were tightening faster than almost any engineering team could reasonably keep pace with, and the truck category that had saved Ford once before was now staring down the exact same kind of existential threat all over again. Except this time, the company had almost no financial cushion left to absorb another multi-year slump. If Ford guessed wrong here, there might not be a third comeback story to tell. This is where Ford made one of the boldest and most expensive engineering gambles in automotive history. A decision so risky that competitors genuinely believed it would backfire and destroy the F-150's reputation forever. Instead of shrinking the truck or abandoning steel construction, Ford's engineers proposed something radical, rebuilding the entire F-150 body out of military-grade aluminum alloy instead of traditional steel. On paper, this sounds like a simple material swap, but in practice, it was a multi-billion-dollar bet on completely unproven manufacturing technology at a scale nobody had ever attempted before in mainstream vehicle production. Aluminum is dramatically lighter than steel, which meant better fuel economy and better payload capacity, solving the exact regulatory and consumer pressure problem Ford was facing. But aluminum is also far more expensive to work with, harder to weld using traditional techniques, and far more difficult to repair after collision damage, which terrified body shops and insurance companies across the country. Ford had to build entirely new manufacturing plants and retrain its entire assembly workforce just to produce this truck at scale. Analysts and even some Ford insiders quietly worried that customers, especially the blue-collar, hard-working customer base that had made the F-150 into an American institution, would reject the idea of an aluminum truck as feeling cheap, fragile, or somehow less tough than the steel trucks their fathers and grandfathers had trusted for generations. The gamble could have destroyed the most valuable product line the company had ever built. If customers rejected the aluminum F-151, F-150, Ford wouldn't just lose sales, they would lose the single largest profit engine keeping the entire corporation financially healthy. Losing the F-150's dominance could have meant a second near-death experience for the company within a single generation. And it wasn't only customers Ford had to convince. Insurance companies didn't yet have reliable data on repair costs for an aluminum-bodied mainstream truck built at this kind of massive volume, which meant insurance premiums for the new F-150 were a complete unknown variable that could have scared away budget-conscious buyers before they even got behind the wheel. Body shops across the country had to be retrained and re-equipped with entirely new tools just to handle aluminum repairs correctly. And until that infrastructure caught up, plenty of skeptics assumed customers would simply avoid the risk and buy a competitor's steel truck instead, just to sidestep the uncertainty. Every single piece of this rollout carried the potential to blow up in Ford's face at the worst possible moment. It didn't fail. When the aluminum-bodied F-150 launched in 2015, it delivered exactly what Ford promised, a truck that was hundreds of pounds lighter, dramatically more fuel-efficient, and capable of hauling and towing more weight than the steel version it replaced, all while meeting increasingly strict government fuel economy standards that were threatening to strangle the entire full-size truck category. Customers didn't run away from the change, they embraced it. Sales didn't just hold steady, they grew. The F-Series maintained its position as the best-selling vehicle in America, extending a streak that eventually stretched past 4 decades of uninterrupted dominance, a record that remains virtually untouched anywhere else in the global auto industry. Today, the F-Series isn't just a truck anymore, it's the financial backbone of the entire Ford Motor Company. Industry analysts have estimated that the F-Series alone generates more annual revenue than entire standalone companies like Nike or Coca-Cola. Some years, the profit generated from F-Series trucks alone has accounted for the overwhelming majority of Ford's entire global profit across every single vehicle line combined, cars, SUVs, and everything else put together. Think about the sheer irony baked into that fact. The product category that Ford's own executives twice considered cutting, shrinking, or abandoning entirely during moments of genuine existential crisis for the company ended up becoming the single most important reason Ford Motor Company still exists as a profitable, publicly traded corporation today. Every single time the world threw an economic disaster at this truck, an oil crisis, a recession, tightening regulation, it didn't just survive, it came back stronger, more dominant, and more profitable than before. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. Even after the aluminum gamble paid off, Ford didn't stop pushing. They kept iterating on the F-150 nearly every single year, adding a hybrid electric version, a fully electric version called the Lightning, turbocharged EcoBoost engines that delivered muscle car-level torque while sieving fuel far more efficiently than the big V8s of decades past, and even massaging luxury trim levels so expensive and so loaded with technology that a fully equipped F-150 could cost more than a Mercedes sedan. Every single one of these moves carried its own version of the same risk the company faced back in 1979 and again in 2008. The risk of alienating a loyal customer base by changing too much, too fast. And every single time, Ford managed to walk that tightrope without losing the trust that had taken nearly a century to build. There's a brutal lesson buried in this story that goes far beyond just cars and trucks. The people who nearly killed the F-Series weren't stupid, and they weren't bad at their jobs. They were looking at real numbers, real financial pressure, and a genuinely terrifying economic environment, and they made what seemed like the logical, responsible decision in the moment. But the people who saved it weren't just gambling blindly either. They looked past the panic in the short-term data and identified the one thing that mattered more than any spreadsheet, the loyalty and the real underlying need of the customer who depended on that product every single day. That distinction between reacting to fear and understanding your actual customer is exactly what separated a company that almost destroyed its own golden goose from a company that turned that same golden goose into the most profitable vehicle program in automotive history. So the next time you see an F-150 sitting in a driveway, or hauling equipment down the highway, remember that this ordinary-looking truck survived two separate near-death experiences that could have wiped it off the map entirely, and each time, it came back to make Ford more money than anyone inside that company ever imagined possible back in 1917 when the very first Model TT rolled quietly off the assembly line as nothing more than an afterthought. Nobody could have predicted that this unglamorous workhorse would one day outsell every car Ford ever built and become the single most valuable vehicle nameplate in the history of American manufacturing. If this story blew your mind, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because we've got dozens more insane corporate stories just like this one waiting for you. Stories about billion-dollar bets, near bankruptcies, and the wild decisions that shaped the biggest brands in the world. Drop a comment below and let us know, did you already know how close Ford came to killing this truck, or is your mind completely blown right now? We will see you in the next video. Clow.